Scott is a senior solutions consultant for Infor, where he works with clients and prospects to define and deliver innovative SaaS solutions. Mike is an expert on application of activity-based costing and process-based methodology. For the past 25 years, he worked with many organizations to develop cost models that support a number of strategic and operational initiatives. For the past 15 years, Mike has been focused exclusively on healthcare, where he supported hospitals to achieve and sustain success in the era of healthcare reform. Mike holds a BS in economics from Illinois State University. Mike is a member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, AICPA. Mike is a past winner of the Helen Yerger L. Van Sewell Best Article Award annually by HFMA. Anthony Hare recently joined Infor as Financial Strategy Director for Healthcare, where he is responsible for thought leadership. In this role, he engages with senior healthcare financial executives, i.e. CFOs, controllers, VP finance, and understanding their needs and shaping the future of industry. He has over 25 years of global experience and has spent the majority of his career leading and partnering with executives to drive financial and operational improvement and efficiencies. Anthony's healthcare experience covers pediatric and adult hospitals, including academic medical centers, the intellectual and developmental disability segment, residential care, rehabilitation, state and federal regulators and vendors. Anthony holds a Sloan Fellow, MBA from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and is a member of the Certified Practicing Accountant, CPA. With that being said, Anthony, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today with my colleague Mike. Looking forward to sharing our thoughts and having an interactive and informative session today. What we're looking at getting out of today is the learning objectives, just having an in-depth discussion in relation to the outcomes, and then what we'll be looking at doing from a cleanly collected financial operations perspective is discussing the 5 stages of the maturity curve. And then obviously at the end, we'll be allowing some time, approximately 15 minutes, to have some questions and answers. So please feel free to send your questions in along the way. The learning objectives, what we're looking at doing today is understanding the approaches from connecting resource level expenditures and patient level revenue transactions. In that component, we'll be discussing and highlighting some options and some tools that will be available to you all. After that, what we want to do is get into connect metrics and analytics and understand some KPIs and some evolutions and some decision support. And from a soft perspective and a strategic perspective, as a finance team, how does that impact our staffing resources? And do we have the necessary staff in place as we go along the evolution journey? And finally, then what we want to do is facilitate or have a conversation in relation to the facilitation and the buy-in of how we just not get the physician side and the finance teams together, but really all of the healthcare enterprise, and that's executive suite employees from a 360 perspective. And that will detail sort of some soft components, some change management skills, and hopefully Mike and I will be able to share a couple of stories on that aspect. And on that component, obviously, any audience participation is greatly appreciated. This slide may be very familiar to all with respect to the impediment of being efficient from a quality and affordable care perspective. And one of the things you could potentially do on this slide is break it into silos. From a financial perspective, a clinical perspective, and a business intelligence perspective. Most healthcare organisations perform patient accounting transactions and general finance accounting transactions in separate systems. And even though the advancement of technology has increased the opportunities to collect patient-level activity data at a resource utilization level is still in its infancy. ERP applications traditionally focus more on resource procurement and maintenance rather than resource utilisation. For this reason, it continues to be difficult to accurately connect financial results with clinical outcomes. Clinicians are focused on outcomes, while finance is more focused on finance. Ideally, it comes down to how actionable information we can use to set the strategy and achieve financial and care outcomes. As we all know, there's a wealth of valuable information out there, but the question is, how do we use it? This page probably looks very similar to and familiar to all of us. When we were putting this page together, the word that came to both myself and Mike is, it's overwhelming, it's complex, and that's the world that we live in. The question and the task, not just for today, but for the future and for all of us, is ultimately, how do we make this system more efficient, more seamless? How do we overcome those challenges? With the end goal ultimately being improving outcomes in our patient care and the quality of care. And I think that's what everyone on the call wants to do today. It's a tough task. It's not easy. We're all at different stages of the life cycle and maturity along this particular stage and challenge. So again, any thoughts from the audience would be appreciated. We've gone from the past, the challenges. What could the future look like? What's the vision? Ultimately, as I just touched on, it is that patient experience. It is that patient care. It's having that continuity of care and the confirmation. So how do you do that? How do you really do that? That's the challenge facing us at all. At the moment, we want to replace the current level of data extracts, patient level cost embedding, and then that then allows multidimensional intelligence. Ultimately, that's where we want to get to. We want to use the data that we get from our various components, our various tools, our various silos to ultimately make informed decisions for the future. And what do you need to do that? You need to have a connected platform. So on the right-hand side, moving up, then we want to understand our workforce productivity. Are we optimizing our resources? Are they in the right place at the right time? Then our assets and supply chain utilization. How do we optimize that? Then we get to the analytics and intelligence, where we want to eventually evolve to predictive analytics and intelligence. And ultimately, that does drive the patient outcome. All of this is going to be challenging. Every one of us will be at different levels of maturity. We'll be able to get to that ultimate vision at different paces, different changes. It's going to take a lot of resources. But above all, it's just simply not a case of following a process. And Mike will talk about process, and it's certainly based on process. But the one component that we always need to remember is we're in the people business. And this is going to involve a lot of cultural change, whether you're a large 20, 30, 40 healthcare hospital system or you're a community system. We're dealing with people, and so that component of having a process, having a vision, have a strategy in place, combined with that personal aspect, is a key component to today's success. On that note, I'd like to pass it over to Mike, who is going to walk us through the journey and explain to us how we get there.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, everyone, for having us here today. Really appreciate it. So how do we get there? That's the key question. I think the first thing we debated a lot on whether to include this slide, but I think it kind of describes the journey and how we are maturing. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how you place yourself in this sort of timeline. We started out, the EHR history was really focused on, patient transactions. We were really looking at metrics that we looked at, length of stay, census, cost per day. But it was really focused on how we book transactions into the ledger, utilizing that patient information. As the EHRs matured, we moved to more utilization-based type information. So our metrics changed. We went from encounter-based focus to more of a cost per day, cost per patient type. We got we started looking at length of stay across various patient types. Some people started to introduce service lines in here and starting to do that analytics around there. Looking at that cost driver base type, now we're really utilizing that EHR and incorporating, trying to mix that ERP set of data in there to get to more around resource utilization. How effectively are we utilizing our resources? What sort of capacity do we have available? How effective are we at that? And so the metrics change. We look at resource rates per patient. We look at how effective our processes are, clinical care in each of the departments. And then where we get to in the future is, relying on, more process-based technology. We're really moving here away from that traditional metric to really analyzing that care continuum. Much more real time, much more process-based intelligence. So we're not making decisions, from a strategic 30,000 foot view. We continue as we move from revenue-based to utilization-based through the line there to more of an operational base and more of a predictive base. So it's really, I think it'll be really interesting, and I would love to talk to a whole bunch of you about where you think you are in that line, and sort of that assessment. And as we go through the rest of the slides, you'll start to see how that connects. So what does the current state look like? You may see yourself in this. Some may be a little more advanced. Some may not be. But it's really, we're really looking at this from the focus really here is on transactions. We're limited in the use of our ERP. It's more of akin catching statistics or catching financial statistics, and we're looking at transactions. And then we have some limited information that we use to track department logs, really how many, how long. And on the ERP side, it's really a limited view of all of the resources that we have available to us. So this is on the right, we see that traditional ERP. On the left, we see that traditional connection to our clinical system. Again, some will be more or less around this. And then in the middle, you see that sort of decision support piece that sort of finishes the platform. And so what this requires, lots of data extracts. It requires feeds and a lot of time and energy to make relations to these. So not the most effective process, but it's really, again, we're looking at simple metrics here. We might get to cost per encounter. We might get to service line analysis. But why wouldn't we, at a minimum, include an asset management and a workforce management tool as part of our ERP? So it's really now connecting all of those key business applications. And when I mean key business applications that allow us to track all of our critical assets that are involved in the delivery of care. So, I think the last statistic I saw was 58 or 59% of our resource consumption is labor. But yet that's not integrated into our ERP and doesn't allow us then to calculate how effectively we are using our resources. So it seems kind of crazy to me that we wouldn't track that number one asset in there. So really what this does is it allows you to move from just, simple utilization of supplies and tracking transactions to actually establishing resource rates. How effective are we? When I look at resources, when I look at my workforce team, how productive are they? How much time is productive? How much time is required maintenance, even on people? How much training? How much management time do they need? And then how much of that time is available for care? So that I can make that connection and bring that into my decision platforms so that I can start to say, when I look at the number of cases, when I look at the number of orders, when I look at the number of procedures, it makes it a lot easier to relate those to that type of information. Same on my assets. I would want to track my assets. I need to do maintenance on my assets. So I'd want to know, which equipment is being used, how often is it being used, what maintenance is going to it. So it's really moving from sort of that average level costing down to much more specific resource costing. And then you can even start to introduce capacity costing in here as well. Why not take advantage of all the the wonderful tools and vendors and applications out there to modernize your EHR. So the EHR, in the past, the financial component has been what I consider very limited. And as somebody who spent years doing this, I've always spent a lot of time querying and doing relations and connecting data. So there's a lot of technology out there that allows you to expand this view to capture additional information in your ERP, such as service lines, such as financial class, such as physicians, location, procedures. So a lot of this information can be transaction or recorded in your ERP, which then allows you to, make that further connection. So now I'm connecting better to my EHR. I'm starting to improve my ability to do dimensional reporting. And it really introduces that variability. Now I've gone from productivity in general to now productivity across key dimensions, whether it's service line or a location. And now I can start to compare variability. So when I look at, a group of orthopedic surgeons doing services in location A versus a group of orthopedic surgeons doing, services in location B, I can do that direct comparison. What is the unit cost versus at each location? How do they utilize supplies? What's in their order sets? What's their length of stay? How much med surge time do they utilize? How much rehab do they order? Because now I can start to, by using that variability and understanding, I can use that information to achieve best practices, for my institution, and then also use that to drive change. And this is where we start really getting that connection to the clinical. At the beginning, when we just bring in and expand EHR, the clinicians can now see, how effective what resources are available to do productivity, and making that connection to the EHR into that clinical data now brings finance and clinicians together. Expanding that ERP gives that additional information and dimensionality that allows you to do a much better job at reporting, as well as recording transactions. And now by using that, I'm making really effective connections to the record and to the statistics and to time and all of these other things that can come out of the ERP. So it's really, here we're really capitalizing on connectivity, and this is where clinicians really start to come together. They do earlier, but then they really get much more effective here at this point. The clinical data in the modern EHR is very rich. What drove me to healthcare a long time ago was the excitement of there's so much data, so much wealth of information out there that allows us to make really effective decisions, or allows us to create a decision platform that allows us to get to those decisions. So, for me, this is really exciting. So why not bring in some of this data into our decision platform? Why not capitalize on this? There's a lot of integration engines and capability out there in the market to bring this sort of stuff in here. To bring in prep minutes, procedure minutes, recovery minutes, so we can understand processes. And it's not just in the EHR, it's in those subsystems that are attached to it. So in your surgery systems, in your radiology, those departmental logs, they're capturing a lot of information. A lot of that can be used really to understand how a patient flows through. So it's not only just how much time do we spend on prepping. This type of data can also be used to assess that patient experience. How much time are we when we time on the timestamps when they leave the surgery? How long before they actually enter the med surg room and are administered IVs and other things? How much time are they in the med surg room before they start therapy or before a hospitalist or a doctor visits them? So we can not only assess quality, but we can assess that whole patient experience as we go all the way through. Again, a wealth of data out there. I'm not saying boil the ocean, but you may want to start to focus. I would recommend that you focus on key areas and build those and let that mature, and then let that expand into other areas. Again, utilizing technology and the data, the rich data that you have in your platforms to get there. And then how does that look? So now we're bringing a lot more information in. Now we're getting to we're moving from, traditional metrics, to much more detailed metrics. And we're applying this. We're doing, we're connecting to the clinical. Listen, we're now engaging clinicians in detail across the entity. We're looking at detail across the care continuum. We're really tracking resources across those service centers. We're moving from resource analytics to a more mature analysis where we're looking at the care continuum in the process. So how productive, how effective are we in our flows? My favorite story that I had is, when we did some deeper analytics around this type of stuff, and we looked at those productivity of surgical techs in a particular hospital, we found that they weren't very productive. And when we drove down into that, we found that some surgeons brought their own surgical techs, and that wasn't aware, but we could track that in the data when we went to look at that. And so that was very interesting. It had a huge impact on resources, and it identified a significant opportunity for that hospital to reduce costs. So looking at that, looking at the resources and looking at those key metrics really allows you to start driving those change. And I think there's a lot of technology and a lot of capability out there in the market to get you to that.
So essentially, what we've just gone through is we've come back and we've talked about how do we get to that vision, what's possible. We've walked through how to achieve it from a data and a system perspective. Again, we've highlighted the connected platform, the workforce productivity requirement, the asset and supply chain utilization, analytics, intelligence, and patient experience. That's the ideal scope. And if we're really, really pushing ourselves and we think where the future can be, and we've all seen the rate of technology change over the last 5, 10, 20 years. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember when fax first came back in the early 90s. It was like, wow. And what a cell phone was the size of a brick at that point in time. So if those of us old enough can cast our mind back, we can appreciate how technology has changed. So let's look a little bit further. Let's push the boundaries. What does real-time point of care sound like and feel like? What's that advanced intelligence component feel and look like? That's ultimately where we can go. And we know that now. And let's all think, if we're on the internet browsing something at home and it gets hooked up for a second, the world's crashing on us. We want that information now. So why can't we have that in healthcare? Why can't we have that real-time point of care? I think that's where we need to, as practitioners, as consultants, as people who are passionate about the healthcare industry, let's push that. Let's make sure that's where we want to go to. Because ultimately that real-time point of care is going to help the patient. It is. It really is. So talking about the next slide, process intelligence and location intelligence. What we're really talking about here is how RTLS allows for tracking and understanding our resource use. Wouldn't it be great to know that we've got 30 pumps on a particular floor and 5 of them are just about to expire or run out of life or come up for their maintenance? Or actually, we've got 30 on the floor, but we've got another 20 hidden in cupboards because we're conscious that supply chain may not be aware of that. I'm sure we've all been through that. And this sort of intelligence, this sort of data mining, this sort of asset utilization is prevalent in other industries outside healthcare. And hopefully some of us on this call may even be using this or at this stage. Do we need 30 or actually do we only need 5? From a financial perspective and a supply chain perspective, all of a sudden we're managing our cash flow better. We're not having large cases of inventory. But from a clinical perspective, we're making sure that those clinical tools are where the nurses and the physicians and the clinicians need it. They're at their hand. They're not on the other floor. And that's where intelligence is going to take us. This slide talks about advanced risk management enabled by that location intelligence. Using this type of technology not only allows us to understand patient care activities, but it also allows us to documents areas of risk and care management, understanding where our staff are. Are they being utilised? Not in a big brother way, but are they spending their time efficiently? Because ultimately, as we're all aware, that translates to cost or in productivity. What we want to achieve here is productivity for the greater good of healthcare. At 18% US GDP, it's got a big spotlight on it. It's something we all need to be conscious of. So why don't we track our most valuable assets, our people? With 65% of our cost base, we should be doing it. What that does allow us to do is understand our care patterns. And from a resource rate, can we calculate at the very lowest level and compare to specific clinical metrics, i.e. infections, timeliness of required actions? When's that aspirin due? When's it mandatory? From a segue perspective, is it able to allow us to track some of our staff that are real or have a cough? Yes, they still want to come to work and they can contribute, but is there a pattern there? One of the things to note here is this is going to be something that will need to be built up over time. It's not going to provide us the answers or the patterns the first week, the first month we do it. It is going to require quarters, half years of getting those patterns, of understanding where people are going, what they're doing, how do we utilise them better. But ultimately, it comes back to how do we achieve that better patient outcome. What it also does is that it allows the clinicians to start to learn and appreciate lean processes, and for finance to calculate the cost of outcome for each process improvement.
I think the other thing that it does, Anthony, is it takes from, as you start the journey, it moves from risk identification down to risk management to risk avoidance. So that's a key thing in CFO's mind.
Yeah, no, great point there, Mike. Finally, we get to enterprise business and clinical process intelligence. So what does that mean? As we've gone through, as Mike's walked us through the EHR, the ERPs, the costings, the analytics, what does that look like? What's the benefit? Ultimately, there's a big pool of data. So how do we use that? As everyone, I'm making an assumption, but everyone on the call here today, data is only good if you use it. Otherwise, it's a pool of information and numbers. And as finance professionals, as executives across the healthcare world, I think the onus is on us to make sure that we use that data, being in a data-rich environment, to understand how we make life easier, how we make life better. What are the trends? What are the predictive outcomes that we can all appreciate? Ultimately, wouldn't it be great to appreciate letting the data speak and letting some of those untold truths be very transparent for everyone to see? What it does allow is it also allows teams to connect. We're not finance, we're not clinical, we're not supply chain. All of a sudden, we're one from a cultural perspective. And I think that's sort of one of those soft, sublime things that will come out of this is it will force people to work together, because essentially we're all drinking from the same trough and we're all looking at how can we use it better. Ultimately, the future is going to be speaking to our Alexa or a similar type tool of, what's the latest pattern for this particular procedure? What's happened to the last 10 patients that have done this? Has there been any readmittance rates? How long has their length of stay been? That's where we want to get to. And finally, that brings us to our takeaways. Hopefully, we've addressed how to approach and connect expenditure and that patient-level transaction, explain how the metrics and the analytics can be connected for the betterment, and ultimately, and this is what we've got some time to spend on now, take some Q&A, is how to facilitate that buy-in from a connected system perspective, just not from a tool or a data perspective, but how does everyone get on board? And so on that note, Mike, if there's anything you want to add, otherwise we might turn it over to some Q&A.
No, I have nothing to add, so turn it back over to...
I am on the ERP side and do a lot with that. How can I assist the flow work better when there are people who are stuck in their ways with the way it used to be?
Oh my gosh. So Anthony, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the roles that you've seen in the organizations you've worked with to drive that, where you talk about transformation officers and leverage those key assets to create a culture of change.
Exactly. And I think that question is a great question. It's probably one that we can all recognise, both inside and outside of healthcare, and it may not just be from the ERP side. Ultimately, a lot of organisations are silos, but they're breaking down. And one of the things that I've seen in the healthcare world, certainly over the last 3, 4 to 5, 6 years, is the concept of a chief transformation officer. And it's interesting as to why does that particular role, or another role that's starting to evolve, is the chief digital officer or the chief digital analytics officer. Again, they're both sort of roles that are new, and certainly the transformation officer role will have different role profiles and different deliverables. Is it really to transform the organisation from an ERP clinical perspective, make it one? Or is it really to transform, from a perspective of rationalising product suites and locations and things like that? What I always like to sort of start off with is, from a transformation perspective, is what's the catalyst? How do we break down those silos? What caused that question to be asked? Why do we need to transform? Because as we all appreciate, change is difficult. It takes energy, it takes time, it takes resources. What I've seen very successful transformations be is it's all about the people. But what you need to understand is, what issue are you trying to address? Is it a small change or transformation or issue, or is it sort of enterprise-wide? What's the problem? And making sure that all of the various stakeholders are aware of that. And so from the question being asked is, engage the rest of your stakeholders, engage the rest of the organisation, have adult conversation, making sure that you appreciate where everyone's coming from, that people understand, sort of, I have an acronym, sort of, what's WIFTOP, what's in it for the other person. Because at the end of the day, healthcare is a big process and there's lots of handoffs along the way. But then make sure that we have a mission, a vision. What's that end game? And really get all stakeholders and buy-in, whether that's internal or external. External, obviously, patients, local communities, regulators. Internal is the executive team, clinical, physicians, nurses, the C-suite. The one thing I would tip there is, if you do run a transformation process, or if you are in that ERP side of it, you'll probably forget one stakeholder. That's life. It will happen. You'll invite Anthony to the meeting. You'll invite Anthony 10 times to the meeting and he won't turn up. And just as when you're about to go live, he'll say, hey, you didn't invite me, or what about this? That's just one of those things that you deal with people, and you have to have a little bit of a smile about it. But get buy-in. Listen. That's what transformation, and that's what successful transformation is all about, is listening to people and then coming up with that strategy and circling back to all the stakeholders. Is this what you think it is? Is this the problem? This is how we can work together. I wasn't aware that was your problem. Let's get rid of that roadblock. And one of the key components of any successful transformation is having the right people in the right place at the right time. So resource appropriately, have a governance structure, appoint change champions, and then once you kick it off, communicate. Celebrate the successes along the way. Whether it's a 6-month check back to see, hey, we had that ERP team. They've engaged the clinicians. There's now buy-in, there's now communication. Hey, 6 months ago, we weren't even talking to each other. Celebrate the successes. And then, sort of the last sort of component I would sort of say, or two components, is be flexible. The world changes. Healthcare is different today than what it was 12 months ago, 2 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And it's a journey. Whether that's a small transformation or a big transformation, it's a journey. So be mindful of the end. Hopefully that was sort of very obvious to people, but for someone who's done a lot of transformation across a lot of organisations, the key thing that I always remember is it's about people and taking people along for the ride. Hopefully that answers the questions or gives some insight, again, whether it's small or large.
Just add 2 points to that, just short ones. One, my guess is it's probably something around data validity. So ensure that your data is valid as you're working with this team. And two, then engage them in the solutions. The simple question that I used to ask is, why do we do it this way? And nobody had an answer. And so how could we do it different? So I think if you engage them in the solution, they'll take ownership, and then you converted somebody from, somebody stuck in their ways to somebody stuck in new ways. So that would be the key things that I would focus on.
The next question is, I may understand that you build a connection platform. How is it accomplished? Is this an application?
So you could go a couple different routes in that. There are some vendors in place out there that do build connected platforms. On one side or the other, I think when we're talking about a connected platform, we're talking about connecting business to the clinic. And so if as many of your business applications can be on a single platform while your EHR is on a single platform, that makes those connections much easier. But otherwise, if you can simplify those applications, it just makes that whole process much more effective. So a number of people will have a myriad of applications out there where they'll build connections into and use their data warehouses and their EPM tools to make those connections. So it can be one or the other. There's no single everything is on one platform solutions out there, but there are some vendors that do have a suite of applications that are on a single platform on the business side and then work to connect to the EHRs on the other side. So it's a combination of actually connecting with actually looking at your footprint on the applications that you use. And hopefully that answered your question.
Do you believe that the data from price transparency can be used in a future state of this type of review?
I think the intent of that question is really, so by introducing resource rates and by understanding the utilization of both your capacity of your resources as well as the capacity of your processes, you start to understand what the expected cost should be. So that when you look at price transparency, when you break down those costs and understand what a particular procedure costs, you'll know what that breakdown is. So you'll know on a fully allocated cost basis, this is what I need to recover to recoup all the costs in my entity. But on a capacity basis, if I actually charge what I should, what I built it for, I know what that price is, and that's what I should recover. So, I often talk about this example of I built an MRI room and it costs $10,000 a day. I use 5 out of the 10 blocks of time that I have. My fully allocated costs there would be $2,000. On a capacity basis, on that capacity rate, it should be $1,000. And so my strategy should be trying to attain to that price level, down to that cost level with the appropriate margin to get to that. So yes, I think it can be in the future state. I think it should be something that you're considering presently as well. But I think, long term, when you start getting into the whole predictive model, that you can actually, when you get to understanding and doing the data mining and understanding process, that you could actually then start to use that process intelligence that you create to do. I have 2 patients. I have a new patient, and I've had 20 patients that had this treatment pattern, had 20 patients that had this treatment pattern. here's the expected cost, here's the expected cost, here's the expected outcome, here's the expected outcome. So that when people come in and say, hey, this is when they're diagnosed or when they approach your organization about treatment, you can tell them, with this outcome, it costs this much, with this outcome, it costs that much. I mean, I think that's the longer term vision.
And I think that's what the market will want, Mike. Ultimately, we're moving to that age of consumerism, where our patients and consumers just want more information and transparency.
Speaking of metrics and analytics, would any of those metrics have an impact on the time a physician or nurse should spend per patient?
Yes. Again, I think it goes back to the example I just gave when you're talking about, you're looking at those care patterns and, here's what should be expected versus here's what's actually happening. I think the interesting thing about process intelligence and the data mining is everybody has a mental model of how care should happen and what they think is actually happening. And the data will tell them, they'll either validate that or tell them something in an alternative. And then they get to that. So yes, I would think so. But, I think you have to make sure that there's always a quality or a patient experience and an outcome that's connected to that, so that it does tell you, with this outcome, I had more nurse time. With this one, I had less nurse time. So I think it'll be important to make those connections and understand those different care patterns and outcomes.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mike. A couple of things I'd sort of add to that is obviously in that instance, the KPI may well be a guide, not necessarily set in stone, because as we appreciate, healthcare is personal and we're dealing with people, not machines, both from a patient perspective and a clinician sort of perspective. So I think that would be my sort of comment on that. I think one thing that Mike simply started to talk about was if there is significant variances, is understand why the variances are there. Is that inefficiencies in the process, or with that particular length of time that Anthony had to take care of Mike, it was a particular outlier. And I think we're going to get outliers in every situation that we can imagine. But yeah, I think definitely I would personally sort of use that as a guide. I don't think we want to get to the stage where healthcare is a robot picking an action or an item off a shelf.
So there was a follow-up Kylie wrote about that. Thank you. The question is also to help facilities learn how to be more marketable within their communities. So I know in the Netherlands that every hospital publishes all of their prices online, which allows them to compete on the open market. So I've seen, and I used to work with some vendors that did some of that in the Netherlands, and people would travel. So yes, I think once you get to that level of understanding what your outcomes are and what the components of the services and processes are, and attach that to the cost, I think you could very much use that information to be marketable in your communities. And your community could be as big as you want it to be. I did see one orthopedic practice that I worked with in the past where patients came from all over the United States because they advertised it and he was good. There was an orthopedic surgeon that everybody wanted to see. And mostly the doctors wanted to come see him. So he must have been pretty good.
And I think the other point to note, Mike, is let's not make the assumption we're all talking about the same healthcare provider service. The KPIs in an urgent care centre may well be completely different to a perioperative world. So I think it's making sure that I'm a big component on KPIs is essentially they drive behaviour. So make sure that you have the appropriate KPI for your particular setting. And my recommendation, and I'm sure everyone on this call appreciates that sometimes less is more. If we have 30, 40, 50 KPIs, we're just having them for the sake of it and we're getting inundated. So really understand what is the importance that's going to drive your organisation, your quality of care, your mission forward, and focus on approximately 5 to 10 would be my recommendation. But make sure that it's right for you, because the KPIs for me may not be appropriate for Mike's KPIs.
Anthony, you want to take that, or you want me to take that one?
I'll start off, and you can fill in the gaps if I miss any. It's certainly been discussed in the industry. There's certainly vendors out there and people who have artificial intelligence at the back of their mind, if not the forefront of their mind. Definitely there's capabilities out there where a nurse, rather than, as an example, a nurse rather than logging on to his or her sort of PC, can potentially just use their iPhone or their Android to say, you know what, I'm going to take next Monday off, next Monday, Tuesday as leave, rather than sort of going to their PC, and that's sort of something that you can do walking down the corridor. It's that sort of ease of access, and I think with healthcare, we see AI in a lot of particular fields. From a radiology perspective, understanding where cancer may potentially be missed 6 to 10 years ago, now it's starting to be a little bit more predictive. And I definitely think that's sort of something that the healthcare industry is still getting it's starting to get its arms around. I personally think it's a great opportunity. And Mike, feel free to jump in what I missed.
I could see it even being going down to the point where there's discussions around, when you're doing diagnosis of patients and you're filling in that information, and because of all the machine learning and all the process data, that you would actually then have Alexa, whoever's talking back to you, tell you that here's the orders that should be placed. Here are the tests that should be done because this patient exhibits the same conditions and diagnosis and other things and vitals and all that other key information as 250 other patients, and here's the optimized treatment plan for that. And they would actually then do that, and they use that, to sort of plot that plan. So you'd use that, to do that, to say, okay, here's your standard treatment plan. Obviously, the physician should review it and customize it, but I think, that could speed that up, because I know the biggest thing that we see in healthcare is as we do these tests, as we do order things, the tendency from, the compassion and care point of view is to overorder. And so maybe this type of machine learning could be, this artificial intelligence type of thing where you're talking to the computer to say, give me that treatment plan, could help to optimize that and reduce that extra cost, if you will.
The only comment I'd add to that, Mike, and the audience, is what I would recommend or make sure you have your backbone in place. Make sure you have your EHR and your ERP in place before you want to go to digital, so to speak. Having attended a recent conference with some very esteemed researchers, there's a lot of organisations in the world to say that they're digital and using AI, and when you actually ask them what that means, they're not quite sure. A lot of people are still going through that process of making sure, literally what Mike walked us through today, is that you have all your systems, your processes, your data in place. Because once you have that backbone in place, that's when everything will flow off on top, and that's where the AI will be the cream on the top. I would anticipate and I'd advise that it's awfully difficult to try to run before you walk.
The last question is, what steps or prerequisites are there for jump-starting this effort?
I think it's a great question that we could spend a multitude of hours on. It really is where each organisation, where each healthcare system is in its evolution. Is it something that is forced upon us because of the industry conditions of shrinking margins, of mergers, M&As, consolidations, et cetera? None of us want to be in a situation where we have to hand back the keys to the accountant. So there is definitely that sort of pressure, or the more forward-thinking organisations are are really starting to go down this path already. They see the sort of future. So I think ultimately there's going to be a number of drivers that sort of will get the inertia started. What I'd like to hope is that everyone on this call is looking forward and appreciates that we're in 2020 and healthcare is required to become more advanced, more technologically savvy. Absolutely conscious that what we spoke about today may not necessarily be the most sexy, most and exciting environment to spend your money, and fully appreciate the pressures of the clinical side needing capex and resources for capital investment, because ultimately they're always going to say, why can't I have this machine? Why can't I have that X-ray? Why can't I have that machine to ultimately help the patients and their quality of care? But at the same time, we need to make sure that our infrastructure is in place. And as Mike greatly articulated, is to combine the two. Is that business process, it's business intellectual, that business information with the clinical side. Because ultimately that's where the entire organisation will be making smart, educated business decisions for our patients.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is get to connection as quick as you can, even if it's in, outside of your systems, if you can do it in some sort of platform, because if you start deriving information and you start identifying things that you can change together, then you've made connection. So I see a lot of people that want to build the whole thing from beginning to end. It is a journey. So start by connecting. That'll help to identify the priorities, how you want to move along this path, and at what scope and at what level. And then, but in the meantime, you're making decisions and you're making changes, and that will drive those next set of requirements that you need going forward.
At this time, I'm going to ask if you or Anthony or Mike would have any closing remarks.
I think I would just reiterate what I just said, that this is kind of a journey. It will continue to change. It will continue to evolve. The decisions you make will move around. And so, approach it from a pragmatic point of view. What's the next level? Will that help us make better decisions? Will that help us make, achieve better outcomes? And assess that as you move down this path. There's always that perfect system out there, but somebody may not need to go as far, and others will need all of that technology out there. So really try and figure out where's the best place in that timeline or in that curve where you can reside and make those best decisions.
I would simply add, I think it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time for the positive, for everyone on this call, and our colleagues in our various healthcare systems or organisations. Is ultimately we want to use data to impact people's lives for the betterment. And I think all of us on this call being part of that, I think it's a great opportunity to really advance forward.
I would agree.
We have reached the conclusion of today's webinar presentation. I would like to thank our speakers for presenting and Infor for sponsoring this very timely presentation. If you have further questions about this webinar, you may email them to HFMA's Resource Center at resourcecenter@hfma.org. Our Resource Center staff will assist